Last time we covered a lot, and so today's lecture is going to be much shorter and also much less sprawling. As you can probably tell from the title of today's lecture, European Empires, we're just going to pick up some of the select strands of our story to start building a picture of the dynamics of imperial competition as they developed between the Europeans, basically from the time of Columbus to the period just after the Glorious Revolution in England, an event I'll touch on next week, even if only briefly, in talking about the drivers of the American Revolution. But after explaining the development and growth of these imperial dynamics, we're going to then look at the initial evolution of the powers in Europe. Though we won't get too deeply into this either, as your reading for next week, Aloso and Williford, deals specifically with this in the first several pages of the chapter. So just to clarify, in case that introduction of our topics today still left you slightly unclear as to what we're doing, we're basically talking about the European empires from 1550 to 1700, which is why on the map on the first slide there, the lecture, of course, which is on Blackboard as per usual, you see how the map of the world has been divided up by the Europeans as of 1700. That is the start of the 18th century. So just to be really clear, the reason I'm doing this is because in our earlier lectures, I already really brought China and the Ottomans and the Safavids, etc. I've basically already brought all the other regions of the world up to where I want them to be when I start to tie all these regions together into one coherent, intertwined narrative arc, something that will finally start to happen the week after next. Basically, the end of the 18th century is when I'm going to start doing that. Full disclosure, this isn't to say I couldn't have done this previously, only that in constructing this, a survey level course, it's what made the most sense to me. For example, I skipped right over Marco Polo and his brother's trips to China in the later 13th century, the Venetian merchants, who if you watched the supplemental video from last week on the Venetian Republic, you would have met and you would already know this. However, their voyages were hardly critical interactions between Europe and Asia. They didn't dramatically transform as a result. And so I skipped those and a half dozen other things, places where I might have connected all these narratives. After all, some of you might remember in our first lecture, I mentioned that there are records of the peak Roman Empire sending delegations to the court of the Han Chinese dynasty way back in the 3rd century. But anyway, all that to say that while the story I'm going to be telling you today is highly Eurocentric, it isn't because we're ignoring everything else that happened everywhere else. Hopefully, for the purposes of your exam week after next, you remember what happened. And if you don't, please just see the recorded lectures that are linked on Blackboard. That is why they are there. But okay, as you can see, the Spanish and Portuguese possessions haven't changed much by 1700. They're effectively controlling Latin America and the Southwest United States. American history buffs will be interested to note that Spain had acquired the Philippines during this time, which the United States will take from Spain as part of the price of ending the Spanish-American War, essentially over the status of Cuba in 1898. We'll get to that, but I digress for now. Really, what has changed is whereas before in the early 16th century, it was essentially just the Spanish and the Portuguese who are competing for territory. Now it's the Dutch, the French, and the British who are gradually getting involved over the decades and over the centuries. This, of course, happens gradually. And there's a neat graphic I borrowed from a popular book, and you'll see it on the next slide if you move along the PowerPoint, by Ray Dalio. It's a popular book. This is a popular level course called The Changing World Order, and it's basically a graph that shows you the rising and falling and relative power of each of these empires. And it measures their state power in a variety of ways, from economic heft to military strength to territorial extent to population size, and aggregates it all into a rough score. So you can get kind of a general idea of how the powers are relatively situated at any given time during our period that we're covering today. It isn't perfect, but it's something that you can look to for rough guidance. Just a couple of fun observations. If you look there, you'll see the Mongols there, that big first parabolic arc around 1200. And then there's the Dutch later there, from right in the middle of our, basically from 1550 to 1700. Really, the Dutch are going to get a real jump on everyone during this period due to their initial financial and commercial excellence. They're really just miles ahead of everyone. A couple of Italian city-states we mentioned previously accepted, but their geography is just much better in terms of projecting power. Geography isn't destiny, but boy, it does matter an awful lot. And in the case of the Italian city-states, yes, they can, even the empires, they can range the Mediterranean, get up and down the Adriatic, the Ionian, but there's a real bottleneck trying to get out there into the Atlantic. I mean, for example, the Spanish essentially have that completely blocked off. They actually have possession of Sicily, down to Sicily for virtually this entire period, the Spanish Empire. So let's start talking about the growth and development of these competing empires, and then I'll jump back to the slides to explain one of the motivating ideologies that's driving this and which you should know about for the quiz next week, that is mercantilism. Okay, between 1550 and 1700, really the better part of the period, variously known as the Age of Exploration or Age of Discovery, saw the establishment and expansion of the European colonial empires of several powers, the main ones of which we've already mentioned: Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands. So just taking them in order here, Spain and Portugal. Now, I'm aware some of this will be review, but some of this is also on your first exam, so best to listen in as I repeat any points you've already heard regarding Spain and Portugal. You'll recall that in the early 16th century, Spain and Portugal have emerged as leaders in overseas exploration, their seaward geography and crusader spirit combining with the need to find new ways to reliably access East Asian markets following the fall of Constantinople to the Muslim Turks in 1453, really providing them a good initial boost. 40 years later, in 1494, you'll recall there was the Treaty of Tordesillas, brokered by the Pope, which divided the newly discovered lands outside of Europe between Spain and Portugal, basically cut them in half. You'll recall also that the other powers, even the Catholic ones, totally ignored this. However, Spain, under the leadership of conquistadors like Hernan Cortez and Francisco Pizarro, established vast territories in the Americas, including present-day Mexico and Peru. The extraction of precious metals, such as gold and silver, became a driving force behind further Spanish colonial endeavors. Portugal, with explorers like Vasco da Gama and Ferdinand Magellan, focused on maritime routes to Asia and Africa initially. They established trading posts and colonies in regions such as Brazil, India, and various parts of Africa, establishing an extensive maritime empire, including the only ones with access to China in Macau, as you'll recall from one of our early lectures on China. A territory they will eventually totally control, and they actually won't hand that back to Chinese sovereignty around the time I was born in the 1980s. The threat of the French Huguenots moving in, however, that is the French Protestants looking for a new home in what is now Brazil, focused Portuguese efforts on developing the lands they held in South America, just an illustration of how competition in some ways helped to drive this process of settler colonialism. It wasn't always strictly economic, that is, it was about keeping other powers from having it, something we'll really encounter in the later so-called scramble for Africa at the end of the 19th century. Okay, so moving on, some totally new stuff here, England and France. During the 1600s, both England and France are going to be really trying to establish overseas colonies. They'd always been interested, of course, but they had a lot of internal problems and wars to fight with each other. When they get down to it, though, England under Elizabeth I and later during the Stuart period established colonies in North America, including Jamestown in 1607, which was a commercial settlement, as well as nests for their various pirates, privateers, that is pirates like Henry Morgan, who preyed on Spanish treasure fleets with the permission of the English government. Then there was the English East India Company, founded in the early 1600s, which played a crucial role in the development of English trade with Asia. The French, meanwhile, under figures like Champlain, explored and established colonies in North America, especially in Canada and the Mississippi River Valley, with the fur trade and eventually the sugar trade of Saint-Domingue, that is modern-day Haiti, being the significant economic drivers of French colonial efforts, which are frankly always somewhat hampered vis-a-vis the English by the fact that the French resources always have to be divided between land and naval forces. The English are never going to have a massive land army. Even well into the 20th century, it was so small that the German Kaiser warned, when he was warned that the British might intervene, remarked that, well, if they do, I'll send the police to arrest them, meaning, their army is so small and inconsequential, they don't even need the army. Protected from easy invasion by their situation as an island, the English and then the United British Isles will pour money into naval capacity, while the French kings, who are situated right smack in the middle of Europe, will constantly be having to put the majority of their money into the maintenance of a large standing army, which was indeed very expensive to maintain, particularly in an era sorely lacking in financial sophistication. Speaking of financial sophistication, we have the Dutch. Last, but actually least. As you saw on the previous slide, the Dutch are really going to take off the start of our period, taking advantage of their geography and commercial and financial acumen. That is actually it's the Dutch who pioneered the first joint stock company, that is the Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602. They established trading posts and colonies in the East Indies, present-day Indonesia, for example, and competed with the Portuguese for control of key spice trade routes there. The Dutch West India Company, 1621 is when that was established, focused on the Americas, leading to the colonization of New Amsterdam, for among other places, which was later New York, the Caribbean, parts of South America. However, as English power grew opposite the Channel, London frankly decides to provoke a series of wars with the intention of clipping the wings of this potential rival, and they do indeed chop them right down to size. Between 1652 and 1674, 3 wars will be fought, all won by the British, and it was to them the spoils would eventually go. So basically, there you have it. Over the period 1550 to 1700, we see a profound expansion of European colonial empires. Economic motives, including trade and access to valuable resources, played the crucial role most often, as did geopolitical competition among the European powers, as I mentioned previously. The consequences of this era of exploration and colonization had lasting impacts on global trade and cultures in the geopolitical landscape, all of which we'll be talking about as we move forward. Before we go, I'd just like to mention a couple of things. First is mercantilism. I'm actually going to talk about the birth of capitalism and sort of the evolution of capitalism in the context of a whole lecture on the Industrial Revolution. They don't necessarily go hand in hand, but I think it just kind of makes sense with the survey level aspect of this course and sort of the way the chapters are divided. But mercantilism was an early economic system. If you want to think of it as a closed system, what you had was you had powers who thought that the only way to get richer was to accumulate resources to yourself, particularly things like precious metals. And they didn't view trade as a win-win situation. They didn't view things like like taking advantage of comparative advantage, for example, specialization. That's all somewhat distant. So the idea was gains in trade by one came at the expense of others, which can be the case, but doesn't have to be the case. And in fact, trade, if it's optimal, actually leads to gains for everyone. So I know there's some of you who aren't going to be here today, so I just want to really quick go through a couple of things for the quiz. Things that you obviously want to know. What year Columbus set sail? It's just kind of one of the few years that you should just lock into your head there. It's the same year the Reconquest is completed by Ferdinand and Isabella, 1492. The European powers who were initially dominating the Americas, Spain and Portugal, as we talked about, and the Treaty of Tordesillas. From last lecture, you're definitely going to want to be familiar with which conquistadors attacked which empires. And next time, we're going to be looking specifically at why didn't Spain want to dominate Europe? Why the state system developed the way that it did. And it's going to take us right up to the doorstep of the American Revolution, where we will stop for the first exam, which is the week after next. Thanks so much.